Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Mariel Buqué. Dr. Mariel is an Afro-Dominican, Columbia University-trained psychologist, intergenerational trauma expert, and the author of the book, Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma. Her clinical framework is holistic and infuses ancient and indigenous healing practices into a modern, comprehensive therapeutic approach. Dr. Mariel provides healing workshops to Fortune 100 companies, including Google, Twitter, Capital One, and Meta, and lectures within the psychology department of Columbia University. Dr. Mariel is widely sought out for her clinical expertise and trauma approach and has been featured on major media outlets, including The Today Show, Good Morning America, and ABC News. During her doctoral training and then within her clinical position as a psychologist at Columbia University's Irving Medical Center, Dr. Buqué was able to see the profound impact of intergenerational trauma, which led to her adopting a more holistic lens to healing layered trauma. And this is now the underlying methodology behind her proprietary intergenerational healing approach. So welcome to the show, Dr. Mariel. Thank you so much for being my guest.
It's such an honor to be your guest. I'm grateful that you've opened up this conversation for me. Thank you for having me.
I gave a bit of an introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you better, do you mind telling us a little bit about your background and how you got to who and where you are today, please?
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to. So I was born in the Dominican Republic and migrated to the US when I was 5. I think that's an important and critical part of my history and why I even do this work. And the reason being is because when I was actually like in my early 20s, like getting into my career, actually in the media world, I went into advertising. And while I was in advertising, I also felt a lack of fulfillment, and I went back and started doing some volunteer work in my hometown of Newark, New Jersey. And that volunteer work allowed me to see a lot of things, but initially it allowed me to see that I could work in the area of mental health and actually help people in that way, which was never anything that I even knew existed, because it was never anything that was spoken about in any of my communities. Like, we didn't talk about mental health, we didn't talk about psychology, we didn't talk about the possibility that that could even be a career. So when I volunteered, I saw people working in those careers, and I thought, wow, I could really help my people in this way. But also, kind of going back to my roots, I realized that I have always been I think there's a lot of words being thrown around now around being like intuitive or like highly sensitive and things of that nature. I definitely fall somewhere in that spectrum. And I have always wanted to help people to feel better. So whenever I would go to like the immigration office, there would be a lot of people crying because their loved ones, couldn't make it into the States, or they, were likely facing deportation. My father was actually one of those people. And so all of that as a kid, I really wanted to help people to feel better and to heal. And I just never knew that I could actually get into a profession that could help people to do that I could actually be a conduit to healing in some way. But once I actually got into the work, the work started feeling, it actually led me down the path of trauma and intergenerational trauma, just because that's the pain that continued to come up in the work that I did with some of my initial patients. My clients were also, people that belonged to my communities, and they kept saying, well, like, I am struggling, getting through the wounds of this domestic abuse that I suffered for this amount of years. And my mother also was in a relationship where domestic violence was prominent, and so was my grandmother. And so the threads were there. I think we were just not calling them out as clinicians. And so I made it my mission to create a more explicit way to really address these kinds of wounds and bring them back into the communities that I love.
Hmm. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
And you're doing a wonderful job of it. So I wanted to say that so that you can know that you're providing healing and a healing space for so many.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm certainly trying. I think we are in a place in this world where a lot of us are wounded and have like unaddressed wounds that could be helped. And so I'm just grateful and honored to be able to have the tools, a platform, a book, like all the things that can create some level of healing somewhere out in the world.
You touched on this just a little bit, but I wanted to see if maybe you could uh, dive a little bit deeper into it. But what did mental health look like for you growing up, or what didn't it look like for you?
Yeah, there was a lot of pain and trauma in my upbringing, but no one was really talking about it because I don't think anyone had language, right? Like a lot of us don't. Even to this day, there's a lot of us that really struggle with the language around what we're experiencing, what our feelings are, what they are, and what they're telling us really about the inner workings of our minds. But I come from a very impoverished background. Like there's been multiple generations of deep poverty in my family, and there has been, a lot of pain as a result because poverty is a very unique type of trauma. When you feel deprivation and like you don't have enough for basic necessities, it can feel so incredibly existentially like profoundly wounding. Like your the ways that translates as a child are just like so profound. And the same was the case for my mother, although she suffered even deeper poverty in the Dominican Republic, and then my grandmother even deeper poverty for her, right? Like, and so there's like these threads of wounding, of deprivation, of dire needing and not being able to supply, that happened for so many generations and so many years that I recall some of the suffering that my mom had to suffer around economic depravity and wishing, like many children do when they see their parents in pain, wishing I could take it away, wishing I could do something to help her. And my father, once he was able to join us in the US, to help them to not feel so overconsumed by the lack that we had. So all of that has been a part of what has developed a lot in me. There's developed wounds, but it's also developed resourcefulness, character. There's been a lot, right? So I think that I can see a balanced perspective in my life around, the things that have been, that have caused wounds. But a lot of the people that I initially worked with, especially when I worked in Washington Heights in Manhattan in the hospital setting, um, when I worked there, 95% of our patients were Black and Latinx, and almost all of them were exclusively people that were within or below the poverty line. So the work that I was doing, and many of them were Dominican, right, or literally from like a hop and a skip away from where I was born. And so the work felt very personal to me, so much so that I actually had to do a lot of work to not personalize it so much, because I felt a deep duty to do this work well, because I said that these are my people I'm helping. I have to do this well. I have to show up for my community in the best way possible. So I became a super student. I was like, I read every word of every textbook of I was like early to every class, participating in every class, and just like being this like student that was operating at like 1,000%, because I felt a deep duty to make sure that I showed up as best as I could for the people that I love.
Mm. How does it feel now to look back at where you came from and see where you are and what tools and resources you're providing for your community?
I think it's one of the things that brings me the most fulfillment in life. I believe that I have been brought onto this earth to do this work. I believe that wholeheartedly, that I'm living my mission. So I could have a hard day, something could happen. I have especially aging parents, and sometimes, things happen with their health and things like that, um, anybody that loves a dear loved one who's aging, will feel some type of way. And that might be something that can happen in my day. And then a really important balancing act happens with my emotions with regard to the pride and the joy that I feel in the work that I do. So, I think that my work offers me a lot of balance, because the fact that it brings me so much joy, that I feel so in my purpose, makes it so that I'm a lot of anything that can happen in my life always finds its way back to balance, because I have something that balances me out so well.
I see. I know it's got to be fulfilling, especially to look at where you started and now what you're doing and what you're able to give back. That's got to be truly fulfilling. So I can see how it could be so important to you and make you feel so good.
Yeah. Sometimes I think I've lived several lives in this one lifetime, because I come from, in Newark, I had several points of exposure to things that were really painful, right? Like all around me growing up, there was always people that were close to us, friends, family, like a lot of people that didn't make it, right? Like there was a lot of gun violence around me,
Mm,
and so there were a lot of moments where I would see some of my friends and community members like not make it because of drug addiction, right? And so like there were so many moments where there was just so much like happening around me that felt so deeply, um, just it felt like a collective pain. There was like so much pain happening among us community members, having to grieve people on an ongoing basis, like going to so many funerals, and like, of even young people, right? And so that there was so much happening there. And then my life now is so different. And I'm like, what is happening? Like, how am I living this life where, I have emotional stability, I have financial stability, I'm living, you know, in this world where I get to educate folks around mental wellness. Like, it's just, to me, I just can't believe that this is my life sometimes. Like, I'm like, wow, like I literally lived that entire life for like almost 30 years of my life. And the last almost 10 years of my life have been like so drastically different. It's just like I've lived lives, like different lives, in one. So I'm always really, it brings me to a point of gratitude every single day. I wake up with gratitude as the first thing. As soon as I open my eyes, I do a mental list of the things that I'm grateful for, and they're basic. I'm grateful for the fact that I've woken up, that I have a warm home that I can come home to, and I don't have to worry about, did the heat get turned on, that, I get to experience the laughter and joy of my family members, and I can call them, and that they're present and have a loving voice that I can lean on. Like there's so many, I'm really grateful for where I am right now in life, and I don't take it for granted.
that's great. That's nice to hear too. All right, so to kind of get the conversation started about trauma and
Mhm.
to lay a good foundation so that there's clear and understandable language, I wanted to ask, how would you define trauma?
Mhm. Trauma is the ways that we respond to events that overwhelm our capacity to feel safe. So when people talk about trauma, typically in your general kind of day-to-day conversations, I think most people think trauma is referencing an event itself, but it isn't. It's referencing how we coped, how our mind, our body, and our spirit has mechanized a way to cope through adverse circumstances that have tapped out our capacities to feel well or to feel safe. So really trauma is that. Trauma responses or trauma symptoms are coping strategies. Some are helpful. We call them adaptive, right? And they can help us to feel well, to survive, and to thrive. And some not so much. Some can actually continue us on the path of suffering and can actually cause us deeper harm.
How are power and control related to trauma?
I see you've been diving through my work. It's a very big question. I think I can write a book on this, to be honest with you. So at the very basic level, when we feel like we have lost control of ourselves, or there's a possibility that we could, that can lead us to a point of developing trauma symptoms. Because like we have to think about, especially what we call like those big T traumas or those major events that can threaten our sense of safety. Those events typically make us feel as though we have no power in the moment, or we have lost a sense of control of ourselves, of the situation, and the situation has overtaken us in some way. And so power and control are very much implicated in the experience of trauma symptoms or having trauma develop in our lives. And I think that, the question can be answered from a completely different angle, in that when we think about the perspective or the concept of collective trauma, a lot of the, especially systemic forces that have power and control at the center, also make it so that we suffer these deep traumas that are multi-generational. And so, from a very like basic trauma focus, it's very intrapsychic and really just in the mind. Power and control is definitely implicated in how we then process the events that happen to us, and then we develop trauma symptoms. But we can also think of power and control in the context of systemic inequities and the ways that there's a perpetuation of trauma in that area as well.
That was a great answer.
Thank you.
You focus heavily on breaking cycles of trauma. So I wanted to ask, what is a cycle of trauma and how can it be intergenerational?
Cycles of trauma happen when we continuously recycle trauma symptoms or trauma-based behaviors generation to generation. And that's where the intergenerational trauma comes in, where there are a number of different ways that we express these trauma symptoms, and those sometimes get replicated time and again through multiple members of one family, through multiple members of a community, and they become what we then identify as intergenerational trauma. Now, it's a more expansive term than just that. I mean, there's a biological element to intergenerational trauma, there's a psychological element to it. But when we're cycling through these patterns and they become intergenerational, what it typically means is that some of the trauma symptoms or trauma patterns that are being expressed in our own lifetime could have started with our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents. Like, it starts earlier on in the family line, and then it gets replicated forward generation to generation.
How can intergenerational trauma affect the mind, body, and spirit?
This is really the type of trauma that penetrates all three of those levels of our being. Intergenerational trauma, by numerous people that have actually studied this phenomenon from a psychological angle and a spiritual angle, from many angles, scientific and other ways also. It has been considered to be a wounding of the soul. And I really take into that identification of intergenerational trauma because when we think about it, intergenerational trauma impacts our mind, right? In that it transforms our thoughts, and sometimes our thoughts become, in essence, defaulted to look a certain way. Like, for example, our thoughts can be like, nobody can be trusted. I can't. I'm not a lovable person, right? And those tend to be like the recycle thoughts that can go through our minds and continue to be repeated. Our emotions also become, in essence, like in a frozen state. Some people become frozen in shame, frozen in fear, frozen in guilt, right? And so like they have a default set of emotions that also coincide with those thoughts. In the body, our body is a transporter of emotions, right? Like there are many different hormones and many different ways in which the body responds to emotion. And our nervous system is also implicated in that. We can get stuck in a nervous system overdrive state that can overwhelm our bodies and can exhaust our bodies. And sometimes when it becomes a chronic exhaustion that's led by stress, it can even become chronic physical issues like cardiac issues, metabolic issues, like sometimes diabetes, sometimes, autoimmune disorders. And so all of that can happen in the body as stress accumulates in the body over time. And then in the spirit, I like to think of the spirit realm of mental health as one in which we can either be connected or disconnected from ourselves, from others, or from the world, the universe, higher powers. So when we are in a state of trauma, we suffer a lot of dissociation, disconnection. We miss connecting to our core selves. And so all of that is a part of what tends to happen in the trauma process. So our spirit, in essence, doesn't feel grounded, doesn't feel safe. So when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about a wounding that taps into all three of those levels, mind, body, and spirit.
That was
It's a
very
lot.
informative. It's a
Thank
lot,
you.
but it also gives light to like what's happening and what's been happening that like we haven't had a name for. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I remember seeing my grandma just be in a chronic and constant state of hypervigilance. And I
Mm-hmm.
just thought it was because, she was a hard worker or that's what she had to do to maintain. But
Mm-hmm.
now I can look back and say, oh my goodness, she was suffering.
Yeah.
And, that's not how your life is supposed to be. You're not supposed to be constantly on 10.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that could, she was a couple generations out of slavery. So that could have been just everything that she was carrying that she didn't know how to unburden.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it,
Yeah.
it, it's true
Yeah,
for sure.
absolutely. And there's Dr. Georgia Grew helps us with a
Mm.
concept called post-traumatic slave syndrome. I can see you're already familiar with what it is,
Yep.
which helps us to understand the multitude of ways in which bodies that have legacies of slavery, live in these traumatized states that carry on for generations. And so that state of unrest, that state of hypervigilance, that state of mistrust, or an inability to really see oneself in a positive light because one has been socially conditioned to see oneself as less than human, right? Like a lot of these things are very much the remnants of these very pervasive mind, body, spirit woundings that have happened for generations to a collective of people. Some of the original, at least the more kind of biological sciences that have come up in reference to intergenerational trauma started off with some of the work by Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who helped us to understand how descendants of Holocaust survivors actually have specific remnants of the pains of their ancestors, right? Of the people that actually suffered through the Holocaust and survived it. And so now, given that we have that set of data. And given that we have a number of other different groups, Native peoples across the world, really, not just in the US, but people that, belong to Aboriginal communities, like, individuals that are descendants of chattel slavery, of African descendants and of the diaspora, and a number of different peoples that collectively have suffered a wounding. Like, we're now doing some of the hard scientific work, the biological work, and also, the psychological work to gather a greater understanding of what has happened to people who have suffered pervasive states of stress for an extended period of time and have never had the tools to reconcile any of that. And so I think it's a really important moment in society that we have, where we can learn what happens to the wounds that don't get tended to, and how can we start tending to these wounds that have these long, long legacies.
I think that leads perfectly into talking about your book. So I wanted to bring that in. And the title of the book is Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma. Can you give us some insight on how the book came to be and what it means to you?
Absolutely. The book initially came to be when I was still actually in the hospital system working as a clinician. I was encountering a lot of these stories that had these intergenerational ties, and feeling like, for years, not one of the clinicians that were a part of our clinical teams, and we had so many clinical teams, some that worked with even like very pervasive, continuous traumas, complex traumas, and no one ever, not once, mentioned the words intergenerational trauma. And I kept thinking, but their parent and their parents' parent, like, everybody's been suffering in very similar ways. Why are we not calling it? And I remember coming upon several texts during that time, all on my own, that felt very enlightening. And through those texts and studies, I was like, there's something here that we're not calling out as clinicians, and we're not being trained to address. So the work for the book, I actually had a number of different people reach out to me and say, you should write a book. And I kept saying for years, like, I don't think, I'm a clinician, I'm not writing a book. That's not my thing. And then, I kept thinking, well, I'm doing the work in this way. I was trained also in holistic methodologies through a 3-year clinical fellowship that I did at Columbia Medical Center. And it was very unique, very innovative for its time. Like, no one was doing it. I was the only clinician, apart from my supervisor, that was actually in the clinics in cardiology and neurology and OBGYN offices, and like actually helping patients with their mental wellness on top of, the other clinicians that were helping with other kind of more physical complaints. And all of that really molded my understanding of intergenerational trauma, but also holistic healing. And I thought, well, okay, if I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write a book that helps us with the tools that we need as clinicians and as people to be able to do the healing work around this. It needs to happen. And so I finally, when I took the plunge and said, okay, I'm going to write the book, there was no question in my mind that it needed to be about this.
I think you were kind of set up perfectly for it based on what you've been saying about your early childhood years, your experiences with so much trauma, and then being in a position to where you were able to compose and compile all of that, and then now give back. So I think it was a perfect fit for you.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel that way, and it's always nice to hear it reflected back to me, and I also feel that on a daily basis, I don't tire of it. I talk about intergenerational trauma to no end, and now I understand some of my colleagues that I also admire. I know that you're someone who treasures and sees the value in IFS treatment. And so, like, I Richard Schwartz, I know, has been talking about this for ages, and I'm like, how can you just talk about this, like, IFS and parts for ages? And I get it. I get the Marsha Linehan like model and how she has been talking about it for ages, right? Like I get in Irving Yalom and him like asserting the need for us to understand group psychotherapy. Like I get all of my colleagues now because I understand how important it is to really help people, our communities, our fellow clinicians to really understand how a model can be helpful. And I don't tire of it. And I think it's really, because I don't tire of it and because I'm so motivated to offer the education that is needed to help eradicate some of these wounds, I know that I am in the right place.
I agree. So talking about generational trauma, there can be some effects within family systems from people who are traumatized, and their behaviors can cause additional traumas. How hard can it be to deal with family who've traumatized you, and how can that affect someone's well-being?
You know, it can be very hard to be doing the work and then go back into environments that, as I call them, are diseased environments, whether there are, places we call home, of their institutions that are diseased and that they're mechanized to cause us harm. All of that can be really hard to go back into when you're doing the work. And so it is why within intergenerational trauma work, I also emphasize how important it is for people to reorient themselves around these kinds of environments, because there is a very high chance that in our generation, our family environments and the system environments won't change enough to produce health in us. So what we have to do is change ourselves and how we orient around these environments and these people and the practices and the ideologies that are held within, both our homes and external systems and communities, in order to hold ourselves differently so that we can be well despite the possibility that those places won't change.
I love the fact that you call them disease, because if you really were to look at it and, call a spade, I feel like that's what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a lot of us have like some sort of a concept that these systems are not working in our favor, especially not working in the favor of the people that it was destined and were constructed to suppress. And the reason why I call them diseased is because they perpetuate harm, right? Like a disease is, a harm perpetuator. And so it's a system, even if it was constructed with the assignment of creating, and especially so if it was constructed with the assignment of creating harm, then it is a system that is disease, it's a system that needs to be treated or dismantled.
What are some common emotions that someone may experience as they work to make changes and break these cycles?
People typically, especially when it comes to intergenerational trauma, I've noticed this even more with intergenerational trauma in my work than with actual trauma proper, like PTSD, with traumas that are even childhood traumas, right? That only like have one generation of childhood trauma. People typically want to get directly to what hurts. And maybe this is really kind of just, people's desperation to fix the wound. But the reality is that we have to get into our bodies in a way that can help our bodies feel like a safe place. And then we can start excavating the layers. So when I get asked, well, what can people do? My first response is always we go into the body. We start befriending our body. We start treating our bodies the way that our bodies need, especially when our bodies have been in this nervous system overdrive for generations. Then we have to get into the nervous system and reconfigure the way the nervous system is working. And we can do that on a day-to-day basis. And we have, even with something as disempowering as trauma, we have within us the power, the option, the opportunity to reconfigure the ways that our bodies are orienting around pain and do something about that layer. Then, when we feel that there is a level of ease that we've been able to acquire, we can then transition into digging into the layers because we feel like we're a bit safer in our own bodies.
I love that you said excavation, because when I think about excavation, I think about like, maybe someone digging through the soil and they find like some bones and they have to like take a brush and be gentle with it. So that really gives a word picture to just how important and sacred that work can be to go into the body and to find, the layers that need to be dealt with and healed and validated and seen and then unburdened.
Wow, that's powerful. I appreciate that analogy. And I actually, it kind of took me back to my childhood a little bit because I've always been a big like dinosaur buff. Like there's something about the dinosaur world that was just like so fascinating to me. And I thought about, my mind immediately went into, well, a lot of these bones needed to be excavated with some level of tenderness, right? To then create this in the entirety of this massive structure. And for us to really see the fullness of like what we have in front of us. Oh, there goes a T-Rex, right? And so we have the full T-Rex in front of us. And it's almost in the same ways that we do some of this excavation work in trauma, where we do a lot of the peeling of the layers through multiple mechanisms, through multiple like practices that I engage in with my clients and that I reflect in the book. And those then get taken together. I call it data collection. And in part, I do that for two reasons. I call it data collection because it really is it's a synthesis of all the things that have happened, and us being able to really collect all that data and look at it more comprehensively. But also it creates, I think, a gentle, healthy distance from the information that's there so that we can kind of co-analyze as clinician and client, right? But once we've gotten all the data that's in front of us, we have an opportunity to really look at the full picture. We have really the whole dinosaur in front of us, right? And we can see what we're working with.
I love that analogy. And as you were saying it, it made me like almost be able to like, if the T-Rex, after everything has been dug up and is assembled, you look at that and you say, wow, that is massive. Like that's so big and so huge. But also you had to take your time and dig it out. And like you said, there had to be tenderness. You had to be gentle, because if you didn't, you break something, you'd never be able to see the finished product. So that could be basically what therapy is. And I've never thought about it like that. That's just blew my mind.
We're co-creating an analogy that works. I love that.
So with trauma, do we often replicate the same dysfunctional relationship patterns that we may have seen in our family?
More often than not, we do. On a subconscious level, sometimes consciously, but there's a lot of subconscious connection to these kinds of patterns. And a lot of people, you and me and clients and therapists and all of us, right? We realize that we've been replicating these patterns, or we have been, as I call us, cycle keepers rather than cycle breakers. When we can see how these patterns are causing pain in our own lives, and then we start digging the layers and saying, oh, I see that. I see that that's the way that my father used to also shut down at the side of stress. And I have a very similar shutdown method. And I avoid, I disengage, I disconnect. I have trouble tolerating the stressor. I see how my father used to do the same thing. And we start seeing that common through line. And in part, it does allow us to have, for some people, right, some version of compassion for the people that are connected to us, that had to suffer in these ways and didn't have the tools that we have in modern day society. or in this generation. And it also, for some people, it brings up other kinds of emotions. It brings up definitely grief, but for some people, that grief is manifested as anger. Like, how could they not work on this? And now I have to suffer through this, and I have to do all this work and like tons of therapy and like, and that's valid too, right? We can be both simultaneously angry, and if it works out in our hearts, also hold compassion for the people that came before us that just didn't have the availability, the tool, and sometimes even the motivation to create the change.
Two things can coexist at once. I love that concept of duality instead of but and. And I think that does allow for compassion while at the same time allowing for all of the parts of you that need to be seen and heard to be validated.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to quote one of your posts. It said, "Your body has an intuitive response to the people around you." Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. That one's really popular, by the way. I think that I'll tell you why I think it's popular. People related to it. I think a lot of us can have some frame of reference to at least one moment in our lives where we felt this knot in our stomach, or this feeling like we didn't feel exactly safe around someone. And the beautiful thing about our bodies, should we be willing to, or have the capacity to, or the tools to tap into it, is that our bodies can be very informative. Our bodies can help us to understand at a very deep level when someone doesn't create comfort or safety for us, and potentially even causes the opposite, or has the possibility of perpetuating harm in our lives. Very often, because we're not taught to tap into our bodies, it just isn't the thing that you grow up learning in school, for example. Because that has been such a major disconnect in our society to not have body consciousness, a lot of us ignore when our bodies are telling us, this person, they're not your person. This person is not the friend that's going to bring you the kind of friendship that you desire and need. This may not be a good partner, because they create this unraveling and almost kind of leave room for the chaos that can burgeon in you to burgeon, rather than they bring you peace and calmness and give you a sense of centeredness, or help you to achieve that for yourself. And so when we have an ability to then just take in a space, like yesterday, I was with 7 women who, for the first time, I've had beautiful conversations with these. It was our first gathering among new friends. And I can tell that whenever I am around new people, I have this calmness about me, because I'm attuned to my body and the ways that I'm responding to people. And especially if there's like more than one person, I just try to really take in what's happening here. How am I taking people's words in? How are people's expressions, engagement with me, energies? Like how are all of those things integrating into my body? And because I now intuitively do that, like it's just like by nature now, I'm just like that person that does that with every encounter that I have. It offers me an opportunity to be very tuned in. And I want that for all of us. I think we should all like have, a level of body awareness that goes beyond what we've been taught. I think that it allows us to have better connection to such a critical part of our being, which is our body, and the multiple points of wisdom that it holds for us.
Body consciousness. That's something I wrote down because it's a simple 2 words, but like it really has a depth to it, because if you think about it, we may know that our heart is racing if we get nervous, right? But I don't think that I have ever looked at body consciousness in a way to be able to be in tune and intuitive the way that you just described.
Mhm.
And I'm glad that you want that for everybody, because being able to share what it is and how it works can allow for us to understand our emotions and understand what the signals that our body is trying to tell us. So I'm grateful that you shared that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thank you for appreciating that piece of the work. I remember when I was still in training and I was doing a full year of like intensive training around different trauma modalities, one of which was prolonged exposure therapy, which I don't think is talked about very often, like in just kind of popularized like psychology or like the social media world. I don't see it very often. And no shade on prolonged exposure therapy. I think it has beautiful clinical utility. It has been tested and proven to have that, right, in many studies. And also, when I was doing that training, I recall that people would have, and we would have actual team meetings where each of our prolonged exposure clients would be discussed. I remember that for my own clients who would text me like after session, for some of the other clients that were a part of the clinic, there was this emotional hangover that people would have that wasn't being addressed. And I kept thinking, like, if they have this emotional hangover, they're going to have this adverse experience in reference to the treatment itself. Like, they're going to, and we would have like actual, like, people drop out of treatment, not return to the next session. And it was almost kind of really eerily like similar, like the stories, like we had a really tough session and then that client would actually not show to the next session. Why? Because they were being avoidant of the potency of that work. And I kept thinking, well, why aren't we grounding people? Why aren't we like bringing them back into their bodies in a safe way rather than saying, okay, trauma session done, see you next week, right?
Mm.
And so that's the thing about like somatics and body work and bringing ourselves back into our bodies, that we re-engage with the body in a way that feels safer so that we can have so that the trauma work can also have sustainability and not these gaps in treatment and like these dropout rates and these other ways in which the work then becomes disrupted because we didn't actually attend to the body.
Wow. That's wild. Right. Would you call it emotional hangover?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oof.
It's not a clinical term, but that's what the one that I use.
I don't think it needs to be.
Yeah. I
Because
think a lot doesn't.
yeah,
We
exactly.
feel it. We feel it. Yeah.
Hmm. Right. So I saw another one of your posts, and I kind of structured this question around that. Can our thoughts be seeking resolution instead of attempting to cause us pain? And if we listen to them instead of avoiding them, is it possible to see and feel the difference?
Absolutely. I have a number of different healers. I'm a big proponent of therapy, of healing work that is holistic. And so I live by that work as well. And I also introduce my family to that work, my patients and clients to that work. So I'm just like very, very much, a, I believe in the power of it. I've seen it. And so for me, it's important to also like step into the depths of my own work that needs to be done, and which is what I do daily, for myself and for others. So, um, I say all that to say that when we are able to lean into um, the work by way of surrender, which is something that I learned from one of my holistic practitioners, who has helped me to sort through some of the layers of my own wounding. When we offer ourselves an opportunity to surrender to the emotions that are there and listen to the thoughts and what they're trying to tell us and what kind of resolution they're hoping to seek on our behalf, we gain curiosity about ourselves, which opens up, greater depth, which is essential for us to build insight to our own psyche, to our own healing even. And so I really do believe in the process of surrender. I mean, therapy itself is a process of surrender. You're literally going into a space and pouring out rather than containing. You're pouring out. There's a way that is a method of surrendering as well. And that is a part of why it's so incredibly potent and effective and useful, is because that surrendering, that pouring out is happening. And there isn't this like harmful containing of all of the things that happen in your world. Instead, there is this, at least like back in the day, they used to call it like catharsis. There is a pouring out and an allowance for there to be like, just a way for our thoughts and our emotions to just like almost kind of be taken outside of the pressure that is in our minds. So when we're able to do all of that, and then we can look at everything that has poured out with curiosity and think, wow, that's something. I really didn't realize that my lack of trust in the friends in my life has come from not feeling a sense of trust in my caregivers because they weren't people that I could sustainably feel like would show up for me. That's insight. That's liberating. That's helpful for me to know about myself. That allows me to step into all of the relationships that I have now in my life with that knowledge, with that understanding that I am operating from that wounded place. And that this lack of trust is not a lack of trust in that person, but a perception that that person can't be trusted because of the general narratives that I grew up having to internalize. And so I really wholeheartedly believe in the process of surrendering, which is why we have to create safety containers in our bodies, which is why if we're working with a healer, a therapist, like we have to feel that there is a safety that is being created in the transaction between those two individuals. And so when safety is there, the surrender becomes a lot easier.
That was so good. I got lost for a second just listening to you and trying to comprehend what you were saying, because I felt it so deeply and was able to relate to it so much. So thank you for that explanation. It was fabulous.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So you utilize your training in holistic care to integrate holistic practices like sound bath meditation and breath work into therapy. How does that help you deepen trauma healing for your clients?
Well, it allows me to get into all of those layers that I mentioned are part of the wounding of the soul, the mind, the body, and the spirit. I believe that when it comes to trauma work, if we are attending to the mind and we're like sorting through everything that happened, but we're not attending to the body, we're just shifting the pain from one dimension to the other. The same goes for our spiritual selves. Like if we are talking about all the traumas and all the things that happened and we're doing all the talk therapy, but we're not really attending to how we can reconnect back to ourselves and reconnect back to the relationships in our lives. Again, we're transitioning the wounding. We're just leaving. Yeah, we're reconciling some of the things that are happening in the mind, maybe reconciling some of the thoughts and emotions related to the original event, but we're not necessarily engaging the body in a way that can feel safe. And that needs to happen because we need to feel sustainably safe in our bodies when we're doing trauma work. And we're also not reconfiguring how relationships are, being held in our lives. And so we're not really doing like the depth of the work that we need to be doing. So for me, it's been critical to really integrate in everything that I do, mind, body, and spirit practices. In my book, I actually take us through different dimensions of intergenerational trauma. And within each of those dimensions, I offer a breaking the cycle practice that taps into the mind, the body, and the spirit. So I engage in that holistic practice through and through in my work, in my book, and everything that I help people to understand about trauma work, because it is really critical and essential.
I think the body was something that I noticed after a couple of years of therapy, talk therapy. I felt like I was ready for more, but I didn't know what it was. And then I started learning about somatic healing and how, the energy in our bodies can be stuck and block our pathways. And then I dove right in. Right
The
in.
right in. I love that for you. I'm glad you did. And I hope that it was fruitful and what you needed and helped to ground you even further.
I'm getting there. I mean, I don't necessarily feel like at this point. I mean, I've done a lot of good work. I have, and I'm proud of what I've done. But I know I still have a long way to go. But I'm going. So
Mm-hmm.
um, that's what keeps me going, because I still have daily struggles. I mean, we all do. We're all human. It's not something that you go to therapy and you have a few good sessions and you say, oh, you know what? I think I'm ready to just be fixed or better. It is a journey. And I know some people are, a little leery of calling it a healing journey or what have you, but to me it is. Because it's something that is going to be continual, because I feel like there's going to be different traumas that affect you, or as you gain more awareness and insight, you may be able to go back to something and see it differently now. And then there's a reprocessing of that, because you didn't have the knowledge to do it before. So it is something that's continual.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. In part, it's beautiful in that way. I know that we live in a quick fix society, so
Mm.
it definitely translates into people wanting a quick fix for something that makes them feel uneasy every day. And why wouldn't we, right? But the reality is that work like this does take time. And when we're talking about undoing decades, sometimes generations of pain, we have to also integrate a bit of patience, some grace, and some compassion for the journey ahead, because it's going to be bumpy and nonlinear, and it's going to likely be lengthy.
You have to become your own paleontologist if you want to get to that T-Rex.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you get to just, have a moment where you're marveling at all of the details and complexities of that structure. And then you get to dive deeper into the work. And for me, even with the pain, I think it's beautiful work. I know that some people sometimes look at me or ask me, like, how do you deal with trauma every single day? And and I feel like it doesn't weigh me down, because I also, because I'm honored, to do this work, but also because I operate from a place of curiosity when it comes to the work. I operate from a place of like being an ongoing learner, a lifelong learner. And I think that helps.
As a woman of color in a space that may not have always been um, welcoming, what does it mean for you to be who you are and to be able to give back to the Black and Brown community?
Hmm. Before it used to be that I was like, we must have a space here. And like, I have to, show up. And it felt like it was driven by the pressure and the tension and the stress and the duty that I felt to make sure that we were represented in these spaces, because the reality is that our experiences can't be told by people that don't understand the experience. I wholeheartedly believe that there is but so far that a person that doesn't live in the bodies that we live in and the experiences that we live in can actually help us heal. So I still stand by that, but it isn't fueled by so much fury, if you may.
Mhm.
It's actually, these days, it's driven by a lot of honor. Like, I'm so honored that I get to step into spaces and that people can see my face and see a reflection of them, of their families in me, and that they can feel held by the fact that they can say something to me and I get it without further explanation. It's critical and imperative that we have people like myself and people not like myself, people of other communities that have an opportunity to hold space in a way that can create a safe container because we can understand the experience without there needing to be like a lot of labor done by our clients. I think that's critical. I think it's ethical. I think it's quality care when we can have a diverse force in the clinical world to show up for the diverse population that we serve. I think that that's one of the highest points of ethics that we can reflect in our care. Right now, therapy still is vastly, by far, I think we're still in the 80% range, if I'm not mistaken, maybe a little less than that, in terms of individuals that identify as white. And as I know it for myself, and also for the people that have approached me throughout the years, thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that have approached me in some way or another, either email or through social media or in other ways, it is holding and healing to be able to have our own reflect our experiences and reflect healing tools. And so the intention that I hold behind this work is also driven by that, by the fact that I want people to heal, and I want them to heal in the way that feels best suited for them. And sometimes it's with the people that look like them and understand them at the deepest level.
I agree so much. Because like you said, if someone doesn't understand your lived experience, it's only so far that they can go.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to have like an unspoken language, or, just to walk into a room with a clinician that has the same life experience, or, understands what it's like to live in a Black or brown body, there's almost just a comfort that comes with that, to where it allows you to open up and be vulnerable, because you're not feeling like there's a pressure that you have to meet this expectation, or that you won't be seen or heard.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like, literally, therapy is about feeling seen and heard. It is a mechanism it is an actual tool of therapy to create an environment where our clients can feel seen and heard. So when there's a disruption in that process, it can be very, very detrimental to the treatment. And so, it's critical. It's critical that we have variable voices represented.
All right. So last question. If you could use your platform to encourage anyone who may be struggling with their big feelings or emotions and on the fence about therapy or talking to someone, what would you say?
I would help people in the ways that I do now, but to understand that they have the capacity each and every single day. There is an opportunity and a choice to do one thing toward breaking the cycle. There is always, we can engage in 5 minutes of deep breathing. We can, sit for a mindful minute. We can take a page of a journal and write down what's happening in our lives and allow for catharsis to happen in that way. We can sign up for therapy if that's accessible. There's always an opportunity. We can decide to respond differently to a situation. And I know that takes a lot of work sometimes, but there's choice there too. So when it comes to something as massive as intergenerational trauma or trauma, many of us feel a sense of overwhelm that the work is so big that it almost feels like insurmountable. But when we break it down into these small bits, it allows us an opportunity to see, oh, I do have an opportunity to chip at this trauma just a bit today, tomorrow, the next day.
Thank you for that. Thank you for this. This has been literally so wonderful and healing and therapeutic. And I'm so grateful that you were willing to give me your time and that you saw value in what I'm doing.
I do see great value, and I am grateful for you. And thank you very much for being willing to have me as one of your guests. I'm honored and grateful to share my insights and to just have a moment to chat with you.
If people want to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
They can find me at drmarielbuqué.com. That's drmarielbuque.com. And there they can find a lot of other things, my social media, my book that's out for pre-order right now, and anything that I'm up to.
That was my next question, is going to be where can the book be found?
Yeah. Yeah. They can find it easily under my book on my website.
All right. Well, Dr. Mariel, I want to say again, thank you for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you so much for the work that you've done to be a bridge of healing to people who look like us, and individuals that need safe spaces and can relate to you. Thank you for who you are, for what you do, and for how you do it.
Thank you for saying so. I'm grateful.